"You're not a real man, Edward. You never have been." The words, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the polite murmur of Sunday dinner conversation at my in-laws' house. Veronica, my wife of 15 years, delivered the pronouncement with a casual disdain, as if commenting on the slightly overcooked roast beef. Her parents, Margaret and George, froze mid-chew, their eyes flicking from Veronica's defiant face to mine. "My name is Edward Alcott, 50 years old, and for the last 25 years, I've been a geotechnical engineer, a man who spends his days analyzing soil mechanics, foundation stability, and the unseen forces that keep a skyscraper from toppling or a bridge from collapsing. My world is one of pressure tests, sheer strength, and the quiet, unyielding laws of physics." Veronica's pronouncement, however, seemed to defy all known principles of social gravity, crashing into the carefully constructed facade of our family gathering. I felt a familiar stillness settle over me, a professional habit of observing stress points and potential fault lines before reacting. I took a slow sip of water, my gaze calm as I met Veronica's. Her eyes, usually a warm hazel, were cold, almost contemptuous. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This was a calculated demolition. Across the table, Margaret, my mother-in-law, looked flustered, a flush rising on her cheeks. She adored Veronica, often to the point of overlooking her more challenging traits. George, my father-in-law, a retired civil engineer and a man of few words but immense integrity, slowly placed his fork down. He looked at Veronica, then his gaze shifted to me, a long, appraising look that I'd come to recognize over the years. It wasn't judgmental, merely observant. Then he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the sudden, uncomfortable silence, "A real man, Veronica, understands the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative facade. Edward designs the foundations that hold cities up. What is it exactly that you build, my dear, besides tension?" Veronica's jaw tightened, her carefully applied lipstick forming a thin, hard line. She opened her mouth to retort, but George held up a hand, a quiet gesture of authority that even she rarely challenged. He didn't say anything more, just picked up his fork and resumed eating, a subtle signal that, for him at least, that particular line of inquiry was closed. The rest of the dinner was an exercise in excruciating politeness. Margaret chattered nervously about her garden club, Veronica sulked, and I made non-committal responses, my mind already beginning the slow, methodical process of analyzing the structural failure in my marriage. George's words echoed in my thoughts. Load-bearing wall versus decorative facade. It was an engineer's metaphor, and it resonated deeply. For years, I had been the load-bearing wall, quietly supporting the weight of our life together, while Veronica increasingly had focused on the facade, the social appearances, the material possessions, the curated image of a successful, dynamic couple. The drive home was silent, a thick, cloying quiet that felt heavier than any spoken anger. Veronica stared out her window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, making them look hard and distant. I didn't press her. An engineer doesn't argue with a seismic event. He assesses the damage and plans the necessary remediation. Or, in some cases, a controlled demolition and a complete rebuild on a more stable foundation. This insult, this public declaration of my inadequacy in her eyes, wasn't the first tremor. There had been others, smaller, more subtle shifts in the ground beneath our marriage. Her increasing impatience with my work, which she'd once admired for its intellectual rigor, but now dismissed as boring and unambitious because it didn't involve flashy presentations or get-rich-quick schemes. Her new circle of friends, people who seemed to value surface gloss over substance, whose conversations revolved around designer labels and exclusive holidays rather than ideas or shared experiences. Her growing obsession with a self-proclaimed lifestyle guru named Julian Vance, a man whose slick online videos promised transformational wealth and limitless personal power to anyone willing to buy his expensive courses and attend his even more expensive retreats. I had dismissed these as phases, minor cracks in the plaster that could be easily patched. But George's words, and Veronica's uncharacteristically brutal public pronouncement suggested something more profound. Perhaps the foundations themselves were compromised. Perhaps Veronica wasn't just dissatisfied. Perhaps she was actively undermining the structure, preparing to condemn it. What she didn't understand, what she had always underestimated about me, was my capacity for patient, thorough analysis and my unwavering commitment to structural integrity, whether in a high-rise building or in my own life. She saw my quiet nature as weakness, my methodical approach as a lack of passion. She had mistaken the steady, load-bearing strength of bedrock for the inert dullness of common earth. And that, I suspected, was about to become a very costly miscalculation on her part. The problem with decorative facades is that they offer no real support. And when the storm hits, they're always the first to crumble. George knew that. And now, so did I, with a clarity that was both chilling and, in a strange way, liberating. The preliminary assessment was complete. The next step was a full-site investigation. The silence in the car on the way home was a living entity, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Veronica finally broke it as I turned onto our street, her voice brittle. "Well, that was embarrassing. Thanks to your father, everyone probably thinks I'm some kind of harpy." I parked the car in the driveway, turned off the engine, and faced her. "What exactly did you hope to achieve with that comment, Veronica? The one about me not being a real man?" Her eyes flashed. "Oh, don't pretend you don't know what I mean, Edward. You're so predictable, so safe. You have no ambition, no fire. You're content with your little blueprints and your soil samples, while other men are out there building empires, taking risks, living real lives." Her words, meant to wound, instead illuminated the chasm that had opened between us. Her definition of a real life had clearly been recalibrated, likely by the slick pronouncements of Julian Vance and her new, superficial friends. My life, dedicated to the tangible, the reliable, the enduring, was anathema to this new creed. "My little blueprints ensure that buildings don't collapse on people, Veronica," I said, my voice calm. "My soil samples prevent catastrophic landslides. There's a certain satisfaction in that, a certain reality that perhaps you've overlooked." She scoffed. "Satisfaction doesn't pay for a villa in Tuscany, Edward, or a front row seat at Fashion Week." And there it was, the underlying strata. Her desires had outgrown the foundations of our shared life, or at least the life she perceived us to have. I didn't argue further. There was no point. I simply got out of the car and went inside, the weight of her disappointment, her ambition, her fundamental misunderstanding of who I was, settling around me like fine dust. That night, I lay awake long after Veronica had fallen into a restless sleep, her breathing shallow and agitated. My mind, trained to analyze complex systems, began to deconstruct our marriage, sifting through 15 years of shared history, looking for the initial stress fractures, the points of divergence. We had met at a university alumni event. I was a young engineer, already passionate about the hidden architecture of the earth. She was vivacious, an art history graduate with a fiery spirit and a quick wit. She'd found my quiet intensity intriguing, a contrast to the boisterous business majors she usually encountered. "You think in layers, don't you, Edward?" she'd said on our third date, her head tilted, a curious smile on her lips. "Most people just see the surface." Back then, she'd appreciated my depth, my methodical nature. When had that appreciation curdled into contempt? Perhaps it was when her own career in art curation failed to ignite, fizzling out into a series of part-time gallery jobs and a growing sense of unfulfillment. Perhaps it was when her friends started achieving the more conventional markers of success, the promotions, the larger houses, the exotic holidays. While we continued to live comfortably but without ostentation, my engineer's salary steady but not spectacular, my investments conservative and long-term. Or perhaps it was the insidious influence of Julian Vance, whose online seminar she'd started attending about 2 years ago. I'd watched a few out of curiosity. Vance was all charisma and empty promises, a purveyor of aspirational jargon designed to make people feel inadequate in their current lives and desperate for his secrets to unlocking wealth and power. His rhetoric about alpha energies and manifesting destiny likely resonated with Veronica's growing dissatisfaction, offering her a convenient narrative. Her life wasn't fulfilling not because of her own choices or a lack of direction, but because she was tethered to a beta partner, a man who wasn't alpha enough to provide the lifestyle she now craved. George's words from dinner echoed again. A real man, Veronica, understands the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative facade. He'd seen it too. He'd seen her increasing focus on the superficial, her dismissal of the foundational. Had he tried to warn me, in his own quiet way, over the years? I recalled conversations, brief and infrequent, where George had asked pointed questions about my work, my long-term projects, the stability of the firms I consulted for. He'd always listened intently, nodding, a thoughtful expression on his face. He'd never offered unsolicited advice about my marriage, but his respect for my profession, for the tangible results of my labor, had always been palpable. He was an engineer, too. He understood the quiet satisfaction of building things that lasted, things that served a real purpose. His comment at dinner hadn't just been a defense of me. It had been a critique of his own daughter's shifting values. I got out of bed and went to my study. On my computer, I pulled up the shared financial accounts. Veronica had her own credit cards linked to our main account for her personal expenses. I rarely scrutinized them, trusting her discretion. Now I did. The expenditures over the past year were eye-opening. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, spent on workshops, seminars, coaching sessions, all with names linked to Vance or his associates. There were charges for designer clothes I'd never seen her wear, expensive salon treatments, dinners at trendy restaurants I'd never been invited to. Her empowerment fund, it seemed, was primarily empowering her to live a life increasingly separate from mine, funded by our joint efforts, or rather, predominantly by my steady income. The decorative facade was becoming very expensive. I also noticed a series of regular, smaller transfers to a separate account I didn't recognize. Not large amounts, a few $100s each month, but consistent over the last 6 months. The memo line was always vague. Consulting, project supplies. What project? What consultant? This required a deeper investigation. This wasn't just about an insult at dinner. This was about a fundamental misalignment, a potential siphoning of resources, and a clear, calculated disdain for the man who provided them. Veronica hadn't just thrown down a gauntlet. She had unwittingly invited a full geotechnical survey of her increasingly unstable terrain, and I was uniquely qualified to conduct it. The foundations of our marriage were indeed compromised. The question was, were they reparable, or was a controlled demolition the only structurally sound option? George's quiet wisdom suggested he already knew the answer. The following week was an exercise in careful observation and discreet data gathering. Veronica, seemingly emboldened by her public denunciation and my lack of immediate, explosive rebuttal, adopted an air of cool detachment. She was often out in the evenings, vague about her destinations, meeting with my networking group, or a strategy session for my new venture. Her new venture, I was beginning to suspect, was an integral part of this emerging, unsettling picture. I decided to pay a visit to my father-in-law. George and I had always shared a quiet understanding, a bond forged more through shared professional respect than effusive conversation. He was usually in his workshop on Saturday mornings, tinkering with old engines or crafting intricate wooden models. I found him there, surrounded by the comforting scent of sawdust and oil, meticulously restoring an antique grandfather clock. "Edward," he said, looking up, his eyes clear and direct. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "Coffee's on the stove." We sat on 2 worn stools, mugs in hand, the rhythmic tick-tock of a dozen clocks filling the comfortable silence for a few moments. Veronica's comment at dinner last Sunday, I began, deciding a direct approach was best with George. It wasn't an isolated incident. George nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the half-assembled clock mechanism on his workbench. "No, I didn't imagine it was. She's been restless. For a while now. She mentioned a new venture, I said, and a man named Julian Vance. Does that name mean anything to you? George's hand tightened around his mug. Vance. Yes. The charlatan. Margaret dragged me to one of his online seminars a while back. All sizzle, no steak. Promises the moon, delivers moonshine. I told Margaret he was a snake oil salesman, but she said Veronica found him inspiring. He sighed a heavy sound. Veronica always did chase butterflies, Edward. Trouble is, she never learned to distinguish the pretty ones from the poisonous ones. She's been spending a significant amount of money on his courses, his coaching, I said, and there are other expenses, unexplained transfers. George looked at me, his expression grim. Are you saying what I think you're saying, son? I'm saying I'm conducting a structural assessment, I replied. The preliminary data is concerning. I found regular payments going in an account I don't recognize. I was hoping you might have some insight, perhaps something Margaret mentioned about Veronica's recent activities. He was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee. Margaret, she worries about Veronica. Indulges her sometimes. Veronica mentioned needing some seed money for an online business a few months ago. Something about curated lifestyle products. Margaret gave her a few thousand from her own savings. Told me it was to help Veronica find her passion. He shook his head. Passion's one thing. Financial sense is another. This Vance fellow, he preys on that. On people looking for shortcuts, for easy answers. He looked up at me. What are you going to do, Edward? First, I need to understand the full extent of the problem, I said. The stability of any structure depends on knowing exactly what forces are acting upon it. Veronica's insult was a surface tremor. I need to find the epicenter. George nodded again, a flicker of something, respect, understanding, in his eyes. A load-bearing wall doesn't crumble from a single gust of wind, Edward. It takes sustained pressure or a fundamental flaw in the design. Or sometimes, he paused, someone deliberately chipping away at the foundations. His words, an extension of his dinner table metaphor, resonated. Was Veronica being a destructive force? Or was she a victim of Vance's manipulations? Or a combination of both? Be careful, son, George said, his voice low. When people get desperate or greedy, they can become unpredictable. Make sure your own foundations are secure. It was more than just advice. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the path I was on, and perhaps a subtle offer of support. I left George's workshop with a clearer understanding. Margaret's loan likely accounted for some of Veronica's initial spending, but the sustained, regular transfers I'd seen suggested something ongoing, something more systematic. And Vance was clearly a key player in this. Back home, I initiated a more thorough, though still discreet, investigation into Julian Vance. His online presence was slick, all motivational platitudes and testimonials from tearful graduates who claimed he'd changed their lives. But a deeper dive, using some of the professional research tools I had access to for due diligence in my engineering work, began to reveal a less savory picture. There were online forums where disgruntled former clients accused him of fraud, of selling overpriced, ineffective courses, of making promises he couldn't keep. There were no formal charges, no lawsuits I could find yet, but a distinct pattern of exploitation emerged. He targeted individuals, often women, who were at a crossroads in their lives, promising them financial independence and personal transformation, then slowly draining their resources through escalating course fees and exclusive mentorship programs. Veronica, with her unfulfilled ambitions and growing disdain for her ordinary life, was his perfect demographic. The small, regular transfers from our joint account, could they be payments to Vance or for something related to his schemes? The memo lines, consulting, project supplies, were vague enough to cover anything. I decided to take a calculated risk. Veronica had mentioned needing to meet with her business mentor that evening. I knew from her shared calendar, a relic from a time when we actually coordinated our lives, that it was at a downtown hotel conference room, one often used for small seminars. I decided to observe from a distance, not to confront, but to gather more data. The sight of Veronica, animated and deferential, talking to a man who perfectly matched Julian Vance's online photos, a man who oozed superficial charm and expensive cologne, confirmed my suspicions. He wasn't just an online guru. He was actively involved in her life, in her venture. And as I watched them interact, saw the almost hypnotic way she hung on his every word, a cold certainty settled in. This wasn't just about Veronica's dissatisfaction. This was about active, external manipulation, with my wife as a willing, if perhaps naive, participant. George was right. Someone was deliberately chipping away at the foundations. And that someone had a name: Julian Vance. The image of Veronica with Julian Vance, her rapt attention fixed on his every suave gesture, solidified my resolve. This was no longer just a marital issue. It was an infiltration, a carefully orchestrated campaign to exploit my wife's vulnerabilities and, by extension, our shared resources. Vance was the seismic force, and Veronica was the compromised structure, transmitting his destructive energies into the heart of our life. My next step was to consult with my solicitor, Alistair McPherson, a shrewd, no-nonsense lawyer I'd used for professional contracts in my initial estate planning years ago, the same planning that George had subtly encouraged. Alistair, much like George, was a man who appreciated solid foundations, both literal and legal. I laid out the situation for him. Veronica's increasing detachment, her involvement with Vance, the suspicious financial transactions, her public insult, and my father-in-law's insightful observations. I didn't frame it as a man seeking revenge, but as an engineer facing a critical structural threat requiring careful, strategic remediation. Alistair listened intently, his steepled fingers resting on his mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair. "Edward," he said, his Scottish burr more pronounced when he was deep in thought, "it seems your household is experiencing what we in the legal profession might term undue influence coupled with a potential for financial impropriety. Mr. Vance sounds like a classic predator, and your wife, regrettably, appears to be a willing, or at least easily led, participant. My primary concern," I stated, "is to protect my assets, particularly those acquired before my marriage or inherited, and to understand the full extent of Veronica's financial entanglement with this man. And, frankly, to ensure that any separation, should it come to that, is conducted on terms that are just and equitable, not dictated by her guru's get-rich-quick fantasies." Alistair nodded. "Prudent. Very prudent. You mentioned your father-in-law, George. His insights are valuable. He clearly has a good measure of his daughter's character and of yours. His metaphorical observation about chipping away at the foundations is astute." He then outlined a course of action. First, a thorough forensic accounting of all joint and personal accounts Veronica had access to. He recommended a specialist he often worked with, a woman named Sarah Holloway, known for her discretion and her ability to trace even the most convoluted financial trails. Second, we needed to review any pre-existing legal agreements, particularly the estate planning documents Veronica had signed years ago. "You said she didn't pay much attention to the fine print?" Alistair asked, a glint in his eye. "That is often the case. And the fine print, Edward, is where the structural integrity of many an agreement lies." He was referring to the clauses we'd included, and my insistence, and with George's tacit approval, regarding the clear separation of premarital assets and inherited wealth, and the establishment of a small, discretionary trust in my name, funded by those assets, designed for long-term security. Veronica had signed off on it, likely assuming it was just more boring stuff. Third, Alistair continued, we need to consider how to manage Mr. Vance. Directly confronting him at this stage might be premature. Better to let him and Veronica continue to believe they are operating undetected. The more evidence of their intentions and actions we gather, the stronger our position. He suggested discreet surveillance of Vance, if legally permissible and within my comfort zone, primarily to understand the nature of his operation and the extent of his influence over Veronica. However, Alistair cautioned, your own emotional well-being in this, Edward, is paramount. Living under such scrutiny, maintaining a facade, can be draining. Ensure you have support. Support. It was a foreign concept in this particular battle. But then I thought of George. He was support in his own quiet, steadfast way. I left Alistair's office with a clear plan and a renewed sense of purpose. Sarah Holloway, the forensic accountant, began her work the following week. Her initial findings, delivered a few days later, were illuminating. The small, regular transfers I'd noticed were indeed going into an account Veronica had opened without my knowledge. From that account, larger, less frequent payments were being made to a corporate entity linked to Julian Vance, Vance Global Dynamics, a name as vacuous as its founder. The total sum funneled over 6 months was close to $20,000. Not a fortune, but significant enough to demonstrate a clear pattern of deception. Sarah also uncovered that Veronica had recently taken out a new credit card in her own name with a surprisingly high limit and had been using it for expensive purchases, more designer clothes, a high-end laptop, and several payments to a travel agency for what looked like first-class flight bookings. Destination: unknown. Was she planning a trip? Or was this part of the lifestyle brand she was supposedly building? The facade, it seemed, required constant, expensive upkeep. During this period, Veronica's behavior at home became even more erratic. She alternated between bursts of almost manic enthusiasm for her projects and periods of sullen withdrawal. She also started making subtle inquiries about selling our house. "Don't you think it's too big for us now, Edward?" she'd asked one evening, her tone casual. "We could downsize, free up some capital for new opportunities." New opportunities? I'd echoed, feigning mild interest. "Like your lifestyle brand?" "Exactly," she'd replied, her eyes gleaming. "Julian says the property market is peaking. It's the perfect time to liquidate assets and reinvest in something with higher growth potential." Julian says, the puppet master pulling the strings. I made non-committal noises, filing away her comments. She was clearly being coached to pressure me into liquidating our most significant joint asset. The structural assessment was nearly complete. The forces acting upon the foundations were clear. Veronica's ambition, fueled by Vance's manipulative greed, was a significant and sustained erosive force. George's analogy was proving tragically accurate. They weren't just chipping away. They were preparing to dynamite the entire structure. But they were about to discover that this particular structure had been reinforced with legal steel and financial concrete they hadn't even known existed. The evidence Sarah Holloway, the forensic accountant, was compiling painted a stark picture of Veronica's escalating financial recklessness and her deepening entanglement with Julian Vance. The new, high-limit credit card was particularly troubling. It was already carrying a substantial balance, spent on items and services that had no discernible connection to any legitimate business venture. It was clear that Veronica was living well beyond our means, or rather, well beyond the means I was aware of, likely fueled by Vance's promises of imminent, massive returns from her investment in his schemes. Alistair McPherson advised patience. Let her accumulate a little more rope, Edward. Her spending patterns, her association with Vance, her attempts to influence you into liquidating assets. It's all building a very clear narrative for us. A narrative that will be invaluable if this proceeds to a contested divorce. The idea of divorce, once a distant, abstract possibility, was now becoming an almost inevitable structural outcome. The current edifice of our marriage was clearly unstable, its foundations rotten. A controlled demolition and a complete rebuild on separate ground seemed the only responsible engineering solution. George, my father-in-law, remained a quiet, steady presence during this period. I'd meet him for coffee occasionally, providing discreet updates. He never pried, never offered unsolicited advice beyond his initial, insightful observations, but his silent support was a significant psychological anchor. During one such meeting, he told me a story about a bridge he'd worked on early in his career. There was a flaw in the original design. "Edward," he'd said, stirring his coffee slowly. "A subtle miscalculation in the load distribution. We didn't catch it until a routine stress test revealed an alarming degree of sway under pressure. Some wanted to patch it, to reinforce it, to save the existing structure. But I argued for a complete redesign, a new foundation. It was more expensive, more disruptive in the short term, but it was the only way to guarantee long-term safety and integrity. He looked at me then, his gaze direct. Sometimes, son, you can't save a compromised structure. You just have to build a new one, stronger and better, on solid ground. His meaning was unmistakable. He wasn't just talking about bridges. He was giving me his blessing, his engineer's imprimatur, to do what needed to be done. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place unexpectedly. Veronica had been increasingly secretive about her new laptop, the expensive one Sarah had flagged on her credit card statements. One afternoon, while Veronica was out at one of her advanced global dynamic strategy sessions, I noticed she'd left it on, open on her desk in her creative sanctuary, a screensaver of dolphins frolicking in a turquoise, sea its only defense. My own laptop, the one she knew I used for work, was in my study. An opportunity, too good to ignore, presented itself. I knew her password. She'd used the same ridiculously simple one for years, a combination of her pet's name and her birth year, a testament to her general lack of concern for digital security. My actions were not born of malicious snooping, but of a grim necessity, a need to understand the full extent of the threat, much like an engineer might use a borescope to inspect the internal integrity of a concrete pillar. What I found was a revelation. Her email inbox was a treasure trove of correspondence with Julian Vance. There were fawning emails from Veronica, detailing her progress in aligning our marital assets with his vision. There were more demanding, manipulative emails from Vance, praising her courage and foresight, while simultaneously pressuring her for more funds, for quicker results. He spoke of our future, of the empire they would build together once she was free from limiting influences, a clear euphemism for me. But the most damning discovery was a folder labeled Project Liberation. Inside was a series of documents, a draft of a divorce petition, clearly prepared by Stratton, Bellwether and Kane, the firm that had later failed to freeze my assets, which made wildly inflated claims about my net worth and demanded a disproportionately large settlement. There were also notes, in Veronica's handwriting, detailing strategies to maximize Alistair's guilt and leverage his desire for a quiet life, to extract a larger share. And then, the piece de resistance, a detailed financial projection for Vance Alcott Enterprises. Apparently my surname was still considered a valuable asset, outlining how my anticipated settlement would be used to fund Vance's various dubious ventures, with Veronica listed as a founding partner but with a suspiciously small equity stake. It was all there, a clear, premeditated plan to systematically dismantle our marriage, seize as much of our joint and my personal wealth as possible, and transfer it to Julian Vance. Her insult at the dinner table, "You're not a real man," was not just an expression of her contempt. It was part of the strategy, designed to undermine my confidence, to make me question my own worth, to make me more amenable to her demands. I meticulously copied the entire Project Liberation folder onto a secure, encrypted thumb drive. This was the irrefutable proof, the core sample that revealed the rot at the heart of her intentions. I closed the laptop, leaving everything exactly as I had found it. There was no triumph in my discovery, only a cold, hard certainty. The structure was not just compromised, it was actively being sabotaged from within by one of its supposed occupants, under the direction of an external predator. Alistair McPherson was impressed, in his understated Scottish way, when I presented him with the contents of the thumb drive. "Well, Edward," he said, after reviewing the documents, "it seems your wife and Mr. Vance have provided us with a remarkably comprehensive blueprint of their intentions. This is quite extraordinary. It moves beyond mere financial impropriety into the realm of what one might term constructive fraud in a marital context." He advised that we now had more than enough to not only defend against any outrageous claims from Veronica, but to go on the offensive, should we choose to. However, he cautioned, the most elegant engineering solutions are often the simplest. Perhaps a quiet, firm presentation of this evidence to Veronica and her counsel will suffice to bring them to a more realistic negotiating position. I agreed. A public, messy demolition was not my style. A precise, controlled implosion, leaving the surrounding structures, namely my peace of mind and my assets, intact, was far more preferable. The stage was set for the final act. Veronica was about to discover that the boring, predictable engineer she had so casually dismissed was, in fact, the designer of a far more robust and resilient structure than she had ever imagined. The opportunity for the quiet, firm presentation of evidence arrived sooner than expected. Veronica, buoyed by what she perceived as my continued obliviousness and perhaps growing impatient for her project liberation to commence, requested a formal meeting. To discuss our future, Alistair, she'd said, her tone imbued with a new, almost condescending, confidence. It's time we made some concrete decisions. She suggested we meet at our home, with her financial advisor, Julian Vance, present. Her current lawyer, Mr. Davies, who had replaced the hapless team from Stratton, Bellwether, and Kane, would also be there. She clearly intended this to be an ambush, a coordinated pressure campaign to force me into agreeing to her terms. I agreed, but with one condition. My solicitor, Alistair McPherson, will also be present, Veronica. And I'd like your father to be there as well, as head of the family. And as someone whose financial acumen I respect, I believe his presence would be beneficial. Veronica hesitated, clearly not anticipating my countermove. The inclusion of her father, George, was not part of her script, but to refuse would look suspicious. Fine, she conceded, a hint of irritation in her voice. If you feel it's necessary. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday morning in our living room, a room that had witnessed so many years of our shared life, now to be the stage for its formal deconstruction. I spent the preceding days with Alistair McPherson, preparing our presentation. It wasn't a legal brief, but a clear, chronological narrative, supported by Sarah Holloway's forensic accounting report and the damning contents of the Project Liberation folder. George arrived first on Saturday, his expression somber but resolute. He simply nodded at me, a silent acknowledgement of the difficult task ahead. Then came Veronica, with Julian Vance in tow. Vance was even more offensively slick in person, his tailored suit a size too tight, his smile a predatory gleam. Mr. Davies, Veronica's lawyer, looked like a man already anticipating a difficult morning. Alistair McPherson arrived last, calm and implacable, his worn leather briefcase a symbol of quiet authority. We sat, an uneasy tableau, in the sun-drenched living room. Vance, clearly positioning himself as the alpha in the room, began. Alistair, he started, his voice oozing synthetic empathy. Veronica has shared with me her deep desire for personal and financial growth, a journey that, regrettably, seems to require a new path, separate from yours. We're here today to facilitate a smooth, amicable transition, to ensure Veronica is empowered to pursue her exciting new ventures. He gestured vaguely, as if encompassing a universe of limitless potential. Mr. Davies then chimed in, outlining Veronica's expectations for the settlement, a hugely inflated spousal support claim, a demand for 70% of all assets, including those of my preservation trust, which he clearly didn't understand, and immediate access to a substantial lump sum for her business launch. It was even more audacious than the draft petition I'd found. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. All eyes turned to me. I looked at Veronica, then at Vance. Before we discuss these expectations, I said, my voice calm, I believe it's important for everyone to have a clear understanding of the actual financial landscape, and perhaps some of the strategic planning that has preceded this meeting. Alistair McPherson then took the floor. With quiet precision, he laid out the facts. He detailed the existence and legal standing of the Alistair Finch Preservation Trust, presenting copies of the signed documents, Veronica's signature clearly visible. He presented Sarah Holloway's report, itemizing Veronica's independent spending, the siphoning of funds to Vance Global Dynamics, the maxed-out credit card. Vance's smile began to twitch. Veronica's face paled. Then, Alastair produced copies of the Project Liberation documents. He read aloud key excerpts. Veronica's notes on maximizing Alastair's guilt, Vance's emails pressuring her for funds, the financial projections for Vance Alcott Enterprises that clearly showed their intent to use my anticipated settlement to fund Vance's schemes. With each revelation, the atmosphere in the room grew colder, more charged. Vance attempted to bluster, to dismiss the documents as misunderstandings and creative brainstorming. Veronica sat frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. Mr. Davies, her lawyer, looked increasingly uncomfortable, shuffling his papers, avoiding eye contact. George, my father-in-law, listened in stony silence, his gaze fixed on his daughter, his disappointment a palpable force in the room. When Alastair finished, he looked directly at Vance. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice like chipped granite, "your involvement with Mrs. Alcott, your attempts to induce her to misappropriate marital and separate assets for your benefit, border on criminal conspiracy and financial fraud. We have ample evidence to pursue this through legal channels, should Mr. Alcott choose to do so." Vance half rose from his seat. "This is slander. I am a respected business consultant. Your respectability, Mr. Vance, is currently under scrutiny by several other parties who feel similarly consulted by you," Alastair retorted coolly. "We are aware of your reputation." It was then that George spoke, his voice quiet but carrying immense weight. He looked at Veronica, his daughter. 15 years ago, Edward, you married into this family. You have been a good husband to my daughter, a steady provider, a man of integrity. I have watched you build your career, manage your affairs, with diligence and honor. And this," he gestured to the documents Alastair had laid out, "this is how you are repaid." He turned to Veronica, his voice filled with a profound, sorrowful anger. "Veronica, I asked you once what you build. It seems the answer is deceit and disappointment. This man, Vance, he is a parasite. And you willingly became his host, at the expense of your husband, your marriage, your own integrity." Veronica finally broke. Tears streamed down her face. "Daddy, I didn't," Julian said. "Julian said what, Veronica?" George interrupted, his voice hardening. "That Edward was weak? That he was an easy mark? That his life's work was yours for the taking?" He looked at me. "Edward, I believe my daughter owes you an apology. And more than that, she owes you a swift, fair, and uncomplicated end to this sorry affair. As for Mr. Vance," George turned his steely gaze on the now visibly sweating guru, "I suggest you remove yourself from my daughter's life and from this house immediately, before I am tempted to discuss your business practices with some friends of mine in the district attorney's office." Vance, his bravado completely shattered, didn't need a second invitation. He practically fled the room, muttering something about a misunderstanding. Mr. Davies, Veronica's lawyer, looked utterly defeated. "Mr. McPherson, Mr. Alcott," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "perhaps we can discuss a more realistic settlement proposal." The controlled implosion had been a success. The facade had crumbled, revealing the rotten core beneath. And the load-bearing wall, the one they had so grievously underestimated, remained standing, stronger than ever. The departure of Julian Vance, a hasty retreat under the unexpected fire of George's quiet wrath and Alastair McPherson's documented evidence, signaled the true collapse of Veronica's Project Liberation. Her lawyer, Mr. Davies, clearly outmaneuvered and likely embarrassed by his client's duplicity, adopted a far more conciliatory tone. The negotiations for the divorce settlement, which Alastair McPherson handled with his usual meticulous efficiency, were swift and largely one-sided. Faced with the irrefutable proof of her financial misdeeds and her premeditated intent, Veronica had little leverage. The Alastair Finch Preservation Trust remained untouched, its sanctity affirmed. The division of truly joint marital assets was conducted fairly, according to the law, but her attempts to claim a share of my premarital or inherited wealth were summarily dismissed. She was left with a settlement that was adequate for a comfortable, if not extravagant, new beginning, but a far cry from the millions she and Vance had envisioned. More significantly, she was left with the wreckage of her reputation within her own family. George, her father, was profoundly disappointed. His quiet, unwavering support for me throughout the ordeal had been a powerful counterweight to Veronica's machinations. He made it clear to Veronica that while she would always be his daughter, his respect for her had been severely damaged, and it would take a long, arduous process of genuine change on her part to even begin to repair it. Margaret, her mother, was heartbroken but finally saw her daughter's flaws with a new, painful clarity, her tendency to enable Veronica's whims replaced by a sad resignation. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. There was no drama, no courtroom battles, just the quiet signing of papers, the legal severing of a bond that had, in truth, dissolved long before. Veronica moved into a small apartment across town. I heard indirectly that she had cut all ties with Julian Vance, who was reportedly facing increasing legal troubles in other states, his empire of false promises crumbling under the weight of his own greed. Her grand lifestyle brand never launched. Her circle of superficial friends seemed to evaporate once her access to our joint finances was curtailed. She was, for the first time in her adult life, truly on her own, forced to confront the consequences of her choices without a safety net or an enabling audience. I sold the house, the scene of so much shared history, both good and bad. It felt like closing a particularly complex and emotionally charged archival file. I found a smaller, more manageable townhouse in a historic district, a place with character and quiet dignity, much like the archives I curated. It had a study with built-in bookshelves and a small garden, a peaceful retreat. George and I maintained our bond. Our Saturday morning coffees in his workshop became a regular ritual. We rarely spoke of Veronica directly, but there was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared appreciation for integrity, for building things, whether bridges, clocks, or lives, on solid, uncompromised foundations. He once looked up from a complex clock escapement he was repairing, his eyes thoughtful. "You know, Edward," he said, "the most important component in any structure, any mechanism, is honesty. Honesty in the materials, honesty in the design, honesty in the execution. Without it, no matter how grand the facade, it's bound to fail eventually." I knew he wasn't just talking about clocks. A year after the divorce, I was invited to give a guest lecture at the university on the challenges of preserving digital archives, a rapidly evolving field. As I stood before the auditorium of eager young students, explaining the complexities of ensuring the long-term integrity of fragile digital records, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. My life, too, had been a kind of archive, one that had faced a significant threat to its integrity. But through careful planning, meticulous documentation, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, its core collection had been preserved. Veronica's insult, "You're not a real man," now echoed with a hollow irony. Her definition of manhood, a superficial construct of ambition and aggression, had proven as flimsy as her business plans. My own understanding, reinforced by George's quiet wisdom, was rooted in something far more enduring. In responsibility, in resilience, in the quiet strength it takes to build and protect, to analyze and understand, to face adversity with calm determination rather than empty bluster. That, I had come to realize, was the true measure of a man, the load-bearing wall that holds steady when the decorative facades inevitably crumble. My personal archive was now secure, its records in order, its future unencumbered. And I, the quiet engineer, the meticulous archivist of my own life, was ready to begin a new collection on a foundation built not of dreams and deceptions, but of solid, unshakable truth. The best structures, after all, are those designed to withstand the test of time and the unforeseen pressures that life inevitably brings. Life settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm. The townhouse became a sanctuary, filled with books, music, and the quiet hum of my own thoughts. My work at the Historical Institute continued to provide intellectual stimulation and a sense of purpose. The preservation of the past, I found, offered a unique perspective on the present, a reminder that all human endeavors, grand or humble, are subject to the tides of time and change. The key was to build with integrity, to document with honesty, and to face challenges with a clear head and a steady hand. I heard occasionally about Veronica through George, who maintained a dutiful, if somewhat strained, connection with his daughter. She was working, he told me, as an administrative assistant at a small nonprofit organization. The dreams of a villa in Tuscany and a global wellness brand had been shelved, replaced by the more mundane realities of earning a living and managing her own modest finances. Julian Vance, according to news reports Alastair McPherson had forwarded me with a certain grim satisfaction, had finally been indicted on multiple counts of fraud and was facing a lengthy prison sentence. His empire of illusion had collapsed. One Saturday, about 2 years after the divorce, George invited me to a small family gathering at his home, a birthday celebration for one of his grandchildren. I was hesitant at first, unsure if it would be awkward, but George was insistent. "You're still family, Edward," he'd said, his voice firm. "Some bonds are built on more than just marriage certificates." Veronica was there. She looked subdued. The expensive clothes and forced vivacity were gone. She was quieter, more reserved. When our eyes met, she offered a small, almost shy, nod of acknowledgement. There was no animosity, no lingering resentment, at least not visibly. Just a quiet recognition of a shared, difficult past. Later, as I was helping George clear away some dishes in the kitchen, he said, "She's different, you know." Humbled. I think she's finally starting to understand what truly matters." He paused, then added, "She told me the other day that she finally realized that all those seminars, all those gurus, they were just selling expensive mirrors, reflecting back her own insecurities and desires. She said you, Edward, were always just solid, like bedrock, and she'd mistaken that for being boring." It was perhaps the closest Veronica would ever come to a true understanding of what she had lost, or rather, what she had thrown away. It wasn't about me being more of a man by her old, flawed metrics. It was about her finally beginning to see the value in qualities she had once dismissed: stability, integrity, quiet strength. My life continued on its steady course. I found new interests, reconnected with old friends I'd neglected during the more fraught years of my marriage. I even started taking sailing lessons, a long-postponed dream. There is a certain appeal to navigating by the stars, to understanding the unseen currents, the forces of wind and tide. Another form of engineering, in a way. The insult that had triggered this whole cascade of events, "You're not a real man," had long since lost its sting. It had become merely another archive data point, a catalyst that had, paradoxically, led to a more authentic and fulfilling life for me. George's words, however, continued to resonate. A real man understands the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative facade. He had seen the truth of our respective characters long before I had fully grasped it. He had understood that true strength isn't about noise or display, but about the quiet, unyielding capacity to bear weight, to withstand pressure, to remain steadfast when the ground beneath shifts. In my quiet way, I had proven him right. I had protected my foundations, weathered the storm, and emerged not unscathed, but certainly wiser and undeniably intact. The archives of my life were secure, and the future, once a source of quiet apprehension, now felt like an open, well-catalogued collection, waiting to be explored with a renewed sense of peace and purpose. The decorative facades might crumble, the ephemeral butterflies might flutter away, but the bedrock, I knew, would always endure. The quiet satisfaction of a life well-ordered and secure became my new norm. The drama of Veronica and Julian Vance faded into a historical footnote, a case study in poor judgment and the inevitable collapse of structures built on deceit. My relationship with George, my former father-in-law, deepened into a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of engineering principles, both literal and metaphorical. We'd often spend Saturday afternoons in his workshop, discussing everything from the tensile strength of new alloys to the subtle mechanics of human folly. He never explicitly said, "I told you so," about Veronica, but his quiet approval of the way I had handled the situation was a constant, unspoken affirmation. He'd sometimes look at a particularly complex piece of machinery he was restoring and say, "It's all about integrity, Edward. Integrity of the materials, integrity of the design. You can't fake that. Sooner or later, the flaws will show." And I knew he wasn't just talking about gears and levers. One day, Alistair McPherson called me with an unusual request. A colleague of his, a solicitor specializing in intellectual property, was dealing with a client, a young inventor, who was being aggressively targeted by a larger corporation trying to steal his innovative designs. "The lad is brilliant, Edward," Alistair had said, "but naive. He's overwhelmed by their legal firepower. I told my colleague about your methodical approach to defending your interests. He wondered if you'd be willing to have an informal chat with his client, perhaps offer some strategic, non-legal advice on how to organize his evidence, how to present his case with clarity and unassailable logic. Your experience as an engineer and as someone who has successfully navigated a rather predatory attack could be invaluable." I agreed. Meeting with the young inventor, seeing his passion and his vulnerability, I found myself drawing on the lessons I'd learned from my own ordeal. I helped him organize his patents, his prototypes, his correspondence, creating a clear, chronological archive of his work, an undeniable record of his innovation. I advised him to remain calm, to focus on the facts, to let the integrity of his work speak for itself, much like I had done. Months later, he called to tell me he'd won his case. The corporation had backed down, faced with the irrefutable evidence of his prior art. "Your advice on an evidentiary firewall, Mr. Alcott, that's what saved me," he'd said, his voice filled with gratitude. They couldn't breach it. An evidentiary firewall. I smiled. It seemed the principles of structural engineering and archival defense had broader applications than I'd imagined.